Chapter 1. The Land and the Legacy. Stephen Jackson had always believed that life's biggest decisions came with warning signs, flashing lights, sirens, maybe even a marching band. But when his phone rang on a quiet Thursday evening, the only sound was the hum of his refrigerator and the faint buzz of city traffic outside his apartment window. He almost didn't answer. He was elbows deep in a spreadsheet, the kind of work that had defined his life for the past decade. Numbers were predictable. They didn't surprise you. They didn't ask you to rearrange your entire existence. The caller ID read Grandpa Earl. Stephen wiped his hands on his jeans and picked up. "Hey, Grandpa. Everything okay?" There was a pause, a long one, filled with the kind of silence that made Stephen sit up straighter. Earl Jackson wasn't a man who hesitated. He was the kind of man who could haggle over cattle prices while fixing a tractor with one hand. "Stephen," Earl said finally, his voice gravelly but steady, "I need to talk to you about the land." Stephen blinked. "The land? The 50 acres out past Miller's Creek. It's yours now." Stephen laughed, because what else do you do when someone casually drops a bomb like that? "Wait, what? Grandpa, that's a lot of land. And a lot of taxes," Earl said dryly. "Social Security and my pension barely cover the property. I don't want the bank sniffing around. You're the one I trust to keep it in the family." Stephen's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Grandpa, are you sure? I mean, that's a big responsibility." "I'm sure," Earl said, and there was no room for argument in his tone. "You've always kept your word. That's what matters." Stephen stared at the muted glow of his laptop screen, the rows of numbers suddenly meaningless. His grandfather's faith in him wasn't just a compliment. It was a weight, settling deep in his chest. "Promise. A bond." "I'll take care of it," Stephen said quietly. "You have my word." "Good." Earl's voice softened, just a fraction. "That land's been in our family for 3 generations. I want it to stay that way." They talked for a few more minutes. Weather, Earl's stubborn knee, the neighbor's new dog. But Stephen barely heard any of it. When he hung up, he sat in silence, the city sounds fading into the background. 50 acres. He rubbed a hand over his face, trying to process the enormity of it. He'd spent his entire adult life chasing a future built on steel and concrete, not soil and timber. His world was deadlines, contracts, and quarterly reports. Land was different. Land was roots. And then, like a spark catching dry tinder, a memory flared. 16-year-old Stephen, sprawled on his bed with a sketchpad, drawing crooked tables and a roaring hearth. A tavern with a name scrawled in bold letters across the top, the Jolly Jester. He could still see it, the long mahogany bar, the dartboards, the musicians in the corner playing lively tunes. A place where laughter spilled like ale, where strangers became friends over tankards and stories. It had been a pipe dream, something he'd tucked away when real life came calling. But now he had land. Not just land, a canvas. Stephen stood and crossed to the window. The city stretched out before him, all glass and steel, a monument to ambition. He'd conquered this world, or at least carved out his corner of it. But it had never felt like home. Not the way Earl's farm had, with its creaky porch swing and the smell of fresh-cut hay. He imagined the tavern rising from the earth, timber beams and stone hearth, warm light spilling onto packed dirt roads. He imagined a medieval town, bustling with vendors and laughter, a place where time slowed and joy lingered. His heart thudded hard and fast. Could he do it? Build something that wasn't just profitable but magical? Something that honored his grandfather's trust and his own long-buried dream? Stephen didn't have the answers yet. But as he stared out at the city skyline, one thing was clear. His life had just changed. And for the first time in years, the future didn't look like a spreadsheet. It looked like a tavern called the Jolly Jester. Chapter 2. The big idea. Stephen didn't sleep that night. He tried, he really did. He brushed his teeth, turned off the lights, even queued up one of those calming playlists that promised to lull you into dreamland. But his mind was a medieval carnival, banners snapping in the wind, laughter echoing through timbered halls. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tavern, the Jolly Jester, alive and bustling, the way he'd imagined it as a kid. By 2 a.m., he gave up. He padded to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the table with his laptop. The spreadsheet he'd abandoned earlier still glowed on the screen, mocking him with its neat columns and sterile numbers. He closed it with a decisive click. Instead, he opened a blank document and typed, "The Jolly Jester Concept Notes." The words looked ridiculous, like something out of a high school fantasy club. But Stephen didn't care. He started typing, fingers flying as if they'd been waiting for this moment for years. Main hall, timber beams, stone hearth, long tables. Bar top, mahogany, polished to a shine. Menu, hearty stews, roasted meats, fresh bread, ale served in tankards. Entertainment, live musicians, dartboards, maybe a storyteller by the fire. He paused, grinning like an idiot. This wasn't just a tavern. It was a world, a place where people could step out of the grind and into something magical. And then the thought hit him like a lightning bolt. Why stop at a tavern? Stephen leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the idea unfurled in his mind. A medieval town. Shops with crooked signs and painted shutters. A blacksmith hammering iron in a forge. A seamstress selling hand-stitched gowns. A cobbler. A baker. A town square buzzing with vendors hawking wares. And beyond that, a festival ground. A Renaissance fair, permanent and thriving, where families could wander through history and laughter. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was business, a destination, something that could draw crowds from miles around. Stephen grabbed a pencil and a stack of printer paper, sketching rough layouts. Roads winding through clusters of storefronts. A central square with a fountain, maybe shaped like a jester, grinning beneath a cap of bells. The tavern anchoring it all, warm and inviting, with a throne by the hearth for the king of this whimsical kingdom. The king would be Earl Jackson. Stephen chuckled softly at the thought. His grandfather, sitting in a carved wooden chair, crown perched on his head, telling stories to visitors over mugs of ale. The image was so vivid it made Stephen's chest ache. He worked until dawn, the city outside his window fading from darkness to pale gray. When the first streaks of sunlight touched the glass, Stephen sat back and surveyed the chaos of sketches and notes scattered across the table. It was insane. It was ambitious. It was possible. He had the land. He had savings. He had a family that believed in hard work and crazy dreams. If he could get them on board, this could happen. Stephen reached for his phone, thumb hovering over his mother's contact. She was the heart of the family, the one who could turn a whisper into a movement. If anyone could rally the troops, it was her. He hesitated for half a second, then hit call. Stephen. Her voice was warm. Even at 7 a.m., honey, is everything okay? Better than okay, Stephen said, grinning at the sketches spread before him. I need you and Dad to come over tonight, and bring the others if you can. Others? She repeated, suspicion creeping in. Stephen Jackson, what are you up to? Something big, he said. Something medieval. There was a pause, then a laugh that sounded like home. Oh Lord, this I've got to hear. Stephen hung up, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and exhilaration. Tonight, he'd pitched the craziest idea of his life. And if they said yes, if they believed in it the way he did, then the Jolly Jester wouldn't just be a dream. It would be the start of something extraordinary. Chapter 3. The Family Conspiracy. Stephen's apartment wasn't built for family meetings. It was sleek and modern, open concept, stainless steel appliances, minimalist decor, but tonight it looked like a medieval war council. His dining table was buried under sketches, notes, and a laptop displaying a crude map of what could generously be called Stephen's Kingdom. By 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Stephen opened it to find his parents, his younger sister Megan, and his older brother Paul, all wearing expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild suspicion. Okay, Megan said, stepping inside and eyeing the mess on the table. Either you've joined a cult or you're planning a theme park. Not a cult, Stephen said, grinning. And not a theme park. Sit down. You're going to love this. Paul raised an eyebrow. That's what you said about your idea to make a smart toaster. It was a good idea, Stephen protested. It burned bread and sent me motivational quotes, Paul deadpanned. I still have nightmares. Stephen rolled his eyes and motioned them toward the table. This is different. This is big. His mother, Linda, settled into a chair, her eyes warm with curiosity. You've got that look, Stephen. The same one you had when you built that treehouse and convinced your cousins it was a pirate ship. Stephen laughed. This is bigger than a treehouse. Okay, here's the deal. Grandpa gave me the land. That got their attention. For pairs of eyes widened in unison. 50 acres? Paul asked. Out by Miller's Creek? Stephen nodded. He didn't want the bank taking it. He trusts me to keep it in the family. Linda's expression softened. That sounds like him. Stephen took a deep breath. I'm going to build something on it. Something incredible. Something that honors him and gives us a business. He spread out the sketches like a magician revealing his cards. Timbered storefronts, winding roads, a central square with a fountain shaped like a jester. And at the heart of it all, a sprawling tavern with a roaring hearth. The Jolly Jester, Stephen said, tapping the tavern sketch. A medieval tavern. But not just that, a whole town. Shops, vendors, a festival ground for Renaissance fairs. A permanent destination. Silence. Then Megan snorted. You're serious? Dead serious. Paul leaned over the sketches, his skepticism melting into intrigue. You want to build a medieval town? Yes, Stephen said, his voice steady. Think about it. People love immersive experiences. Renaissance fairs draw huge crowds, but they're temporary. This would be permanent. A place where families can step back in time. And we'd rent spaces to local vendors. It's not just fun. It's profitable. Linda's eyes sparkled. And Grandpa, Stephen grinned. He's going to be the king. Throne by the fireplace in the tavern. Crown, robe, the works. That earned a laugh from everyone. The kind that filled the room with warmth. Stephen felt his chest loosen. They weren't laughing at him, they were laughing with him. This is crazy, Megan said, shaking her head. But kind of brilliant. Paul rubbed his chin. Permits will be a nightmare. Dad can handle that, Stephen said, turning to his father, who had been quiet until now. Richard Jackson was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. He studied the sketches for a long moment, then looked up. You've thought this through? Stephen nodded. Every detail. I've got savings to start, and if we frame the buildings and use fiberglass for the medieval look, we can keep costs down. Vendors will cover a lot of expenses once we start renting spaces. Richard's mouth twitched. The closest thing to a smile Stephen had seen all week. I'll handle the permits. Linda clapped her hands. I'll start calling the family. If anyone can keep a secret and swing a hammer, it's your cousins. Stephen grinned. Perfect. But we have to keep this from Grandpa. I want it to be a surprise. Oh, honey, Linda said, her eyes dancing. You just gave me the juiciest secret in the family. Consider it done. Stephen looked around the table, at his parents, his siblings, their faces glowing with excitement, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just his dream anymore. It was theirs. Chapter 4. Building the dream, the first nail was a disaster. Stephen had imagined this moment for weeks. The satisfying thunk of hammer on wood, the crisp scent of fresh-cut timber, the thrill of watching his dream take shape. Instead, the nail bent sideways like a stubborn mule, and the hammer ricocheted off the plank with a clang that echoed across the field. Nice start, boss, Paul called from the other side of the frame. Grinning like a man who lived for sibling humiliation, Stephen shot him a look. It's called character building. It's called you should have hired professionals, Megan chimed in, balancing on a ladder as she painted a sign that read ye old cobbler in looping letters. The E was crooked, but she insisted it added authenticity. Stephen straightened the nail and tried again. This time it went in mostly. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, and surveyed the chaos around him. The land had transformed. What had once been a quiet stretch of grass and trees was now a hive of activity. Lumber stacked in neat piles, paint cans scattered like confetti, cousins hauling beams, uncles arguing over measurements, a gaggle of kids chasing each other with cardboard swords. It was loud, messy, and absolutely perfect. Linda stood near the future tavern, clipboard in hand, orchestrating the madness like a general. Stephen, the blacksmith shop needs its facade by Friday, and the seamstress booth is short on volunteers. I'll handle it, Stephen called back, even as Paul muttered, you're going to need a clone. Richard was off negotiating with a local vendor about renting space for a pottery stall. Stephen had overheard snippets of the conversation, something about fair rates and don't try city tricks on me, and smiled. His dad was in his element. The tavern frame rose slowly, beam by beam, like a skeleton stretching toward the sky. Stephen ran his hand along the rough wood, imagining the polished bar top, the glow of lanterns, the laughter spilling out into the night. It was hard work, harder than any spreadsheet or boardroom battle, but it felt good, honest, real. Of course, there were mishaps, like the time Cousin Jake painted a dragon mural on the side of the bakery, facing the wrong direction. Or when Aunt Carol decided the tavern needed a touch of whimsy and installed a jester statue with a grin so wide it looked mildly homicidal. Or the goat incident. Stephen still wasn't sure how the goat got into the half-built tavern, but it had eaten 2 blueprints and a sandwich before anyone noticed. Through it all, Stephen laughed more than he had in years. He worked until his muscles ached, until his hands were blistered, until the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink. And every night, he stood at the edge of the property, looking at the rising town and feeling something deep and fierce in his chest. This wasn't just a project. It was a promise. To his grandfather. To himself. One evening, as the family packed up for the day, Linda walked over and slipped an arm around Stephen's waist. You know, she said softly, I haven't seen you this happy since you were a kid building castles out of cardboard. Stephen smiled, watching the tavern frame cast long shadows across the grass. Feels like I'm building one now. She squeezed his side. Grandpa's going to love this. Stephen's throat tightened. Yeah, he said quietly. He will. And for the first time, Stephen believed it, not as a hope but as a certainty. Chapter 5. The secret almost slips, the plan had been airtight. Keep Grandpa Earl away from Miller's Creek until opening day. Simple, right? Except Earl Jackson wasn't the kind of man you could keep away from his land. Not for long. Stephen was knee-deep in sawdust, hammering the last plank onto the tavern's porch when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and froze. Grandpa Earl, on my way to the land. Wanted to check the fences. Stephen's blood turned to ice. He looked up at the half-built medieval town sprawled across the property like a Renaissance fair on steroids. Timber frames, painted signs, a jester statue grinning like it knew all their secrets. There was no hiding this. Guys, Stephen called, voice cracking like a teenager's. We have a situation. Paul dropped his drill. What kind of situation? The kind with Grandpa in it, Stephen said, waving his phone like a distress signal. He's coming. Now. For a moment, silence. Then chaos. Linda clapped her hands like a drill sergeant. Everyone move. Hide the signs. Cover the tavern. Megan, get that goat out of the porch. Why is there always a goat? Megan groaned, chasing the animal as it trotted smugly toward the jester statue. Stephen's heart pounded as he scanned the property. There was no way to make this look normal. You couldn't exactly disguise a medieval town as a cornfield. Think, Stephen, think, he muttered, pacing. Then it hit him, a terrible, brilliant idea. 5 minutes later, Earl's old pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up dust. Stephen jogged out to meet him, plastering on a smile that felt about as natural as a plastic sword. "Grandpa," Stephen called, waving like a man who definitely wasn't hiding a kingdom behind his back. "What brings you out here?" Earl climbed out, his boots crunching on gravel. "Wanted to check the fences. Make sure the land's still standing." "Oh, it's standing," Stephen said quickly. "Very sturdy." Earl squinted past him. "What's all that?" Stephen's stomach dropped. Behind him, Megan was wrestling the goat into a wheelbarrow. Paul was draping a tarp over the tavern frame, and Cousin Jake was pretending a stack of lumber was modern art. "That," Stephen said, voice high. "A community project." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Community project?" "Yep," Stephen said, nodding so hard his neck ached. "Just beautification. You know, benches, maybe a gazebo. People love gazebos." Earl stared at him for a long moment, his blue eyes sharp as a hawk's. Stephen felt sweat trickle down his spine. Finally, Earl grunted. "Gazebo, huh? Well, don't let them waste good lumber." Stephen exhaled so hard he nearly collapsed. "Wouldn't dream of it." Earl gave the land a final glance, then turned back to his truck. "You're a good man, Stephen. I trust you." Stephen swallowed hard. "Thanks, Grandpa." As the truck disappeared down the road, Stephen sagged against a post, heart still racing. Megan walked over, goat in tow, and smirked. "Gazebo?" she said. "Really? Shut up," Stephen muttered. "It worked." Paul clapped him on the back. "Barely. Next time we need a better cover story." Stephen looked at the rising tavern, the painted signs, the dream that was growing bigger and harder to hide every day. Next time, he thought grimly, there might not be a cover story big enough. Chapter 6. Opening Day Magic. The morning of the grand reveal dawned crisp and golden, the kind of day that felt like a blessing. Sunlight spilled across the 50 acres, turning the timbered storefronts into something out of a storybook. Banners fluttered in the breeze, painted signs gleamed, and the tavern, the Jolly Jester, stood proud at the heart of it all, its mahogany bar polished to a mirror shine. Stephen barely slept the night before. He'd paced the tavern floor until 2 a.m., checking every detail. The hearth stacked with logs, the throne carved and waiting by the fire, the mugs lined up like soldiers ready for battle. Today wasn't just opening day. It was the day his grandfather would see what they'd built. The day Stephen's promise became something real. By 10 o'clock, the family had gathered in the square, buzzing like bees in a hive. Megan adjusted a banner that read "Welcome to Jackson's Hollow," while Paul tested the sound system for the musicians. Linda flitted from booth to booth, making sure every vendor had what they needed. Even the goat, now unofficially named Sir Hoofington, was tied near the blacksmith shop, wearing a jester hat that Megan insisted was non-negotiable. Stephen stood at the tavern door, heart pounding, scanning the dirt road for the familiar rumble of Earl's pickup. When he finally heard it, his breath caught. The truck rolled to a stop, and Earl climbed out slowly, his silver hair catching the sunlight. He looked around, squinting at the colorful chaos, and for a moment, Stephen thought his grandfather might faint. "What in the—" Earl's voice trailed off as he took in the timbered buildings, the painted signs, the laughter spilling from the square. His gaze landed on the tavern, its carved sign swinging gently in the breeze. The Jolly Jester. Stephen stepped forward, throat tight. "Surprise." Earl turned to him, eyes wide and glistening. "Stephen, what is all this?" Stephen swallowed hard. "It's yours, Grandpa. The land, the town, the tavern. We built it for you, for us. A place where people can come together like they used to, where your stories have a home." For a long moment, Earl said nothing. Then his hand trembled as he reached out and gripped Stephen's shoulder. "You did this." His voice cracked. "All of you." Stephen nodded, and suddenly Earl was laughing. A deep, rolling laugh that turned into something wetter, something raw. Tears streaked down his weathered cheeks as he pulled Stephen into a hug so fierce it stole his breath. "I've never," Earl choked out, his voice breaking. "Never thought I'd see something like this." Linda joined the hug, then Paul, then Megan, until the entire family was wrapped around Earl like a human quilt. Vendors clapped, musicians struck up a tune, and someone, Stephen never figured out who, started cheering. When the hug finally broke, Stephen led Earl into the tavern. The hearth crackled, the throne gleamed, and a crown sat waiting on the seat. Earl stared at it, then at Stephen and grinned through his tears. "You expect me to wear that?" Stephen grinned back. "You're the king, Grandpa. Throne by the fire, crown on your head. It's non-negotiable." Earl chuckled, wiping his eyes. "Well, if I'm king, I want ale." Stephen laughed, grabbing a tankard from the bar. "Coming right up, Your Majesty." As Earl settled into the throne, crowned slightly askew, the tavern filled with music and laughter. Outside, the square buzzed with life, vendors hawking wares, kids chasing each other with wooden swords, banners snapping in the wind. It was everything Stephen had imagined and more. And as he stood by the hearth, watching his grandfather smile like a man reborn, Stephen realized something. Dreams weren't just meant to be chased, they were meant to be shared. Chapter 7. The Unexpected Guest. The first festival after opening day was supposed to be smooth sailing. Stephen had planned every detail: vendor schedules, entertainment lineup, even the placement of hay bales for authentic medieval ambience. He'd triple-checked everything. Nothing could go wrong, which of course meant everything did. By noon, the square was packed. Families wandered between booths, kids waved wooden swords, and the tavern hummed with laughter. Stephen stood near the fountain, clipboard in hand, feeling like a general surveying the battlefield. So far, so good. Then Megan appeared, breathless and grinning like she'd just discovered buried treasure. "Stephen," she said, grabbing his arm. "You have to meet someone." Stephen started, but Megan was already dragging him toward the seamstress booth. That's when he saw her. She was standing by a rack of velvet gowns, sunlight catching in her chestnut hair. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes, warm brown, sharp with curiosity, missed nothing. She wore jeans and a simple white blouse, but somehow she looked more regal than half the people in costume. "Stephen," Megan said, practically vibrating with excitement. "This is Clara. She's helping Aunt Carol with the festival prep." Clara turned, and Stephen felt something shift, like the ground tilted just enough to make him catch his breath. "Stephen Jackson," Megan continued, oblivious to the sudden static in the air. "The mastermind behind all this madness." Clara's lips curved into a smile. "So you're the guy who built a medieval town in the middle of nowhere?" Stephen blinked. Guilty." Her smile widened, and there was a spark in her eyes. Amusement, maybe a challenge. "Ambitious." Stephen cleared his throat, trying to remember how words worked. "I prefer visionary." Clara laughed, a low, warm sound that curled through him like smoke. "Visionary, huh? Does that include the homicidal jester statue?" Stephen groaned. "You noticed that. Hard to miss," she said, tilting her head. "It looks like it wants to eat children." Stephen rubbed the back of his neck. "That was Aunt Carol's idea. I'm still negotiating its removal." Clara chuckled, and Stephen found himself grinning like an idiot. He wasn't sure what it was, her confidence, her humor, the way she seemed completely unimpressed by the spectacle around her. But he liked it, more than he expected. "So," Clara said, glancing at the bustling square, "what made you do all this? Most people buy a condo when they inherit land. You built Camelot." Stephen hesitated, then shrugged. "It was a dream, something I've wanted since I was a kid, and it felt like the right time." Clara studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "That's kind of amazing." Before Stephen could respond, Megan popped back in like a human firecracker. "Clara's staying for the whole festival. Isn't that great?" Stephen nodded, trying not to look too eager. "Yeah, great." As Megan bounded off, Clara turned back to the gowns, her fingers trailing over the velvet. Stephen lingered, clipboard forgotten, watching her with a strange, restless energy humming in his chest. He'd built a town, a tavern, a dream. But suddenly, Stephen wondered if the most unexpected part of this adventure wasn't the town at all. It was Clara. Chapter 8. Festival Frenzy. The first official festival was supposed to be a triumph, a celebration of everything Stephen had built. And for the first hour it was. The square buzzed with life, music floated through the air, and the Jolly Jester was packed with patrons laughing over tankards of ale. Stephen stood near the tavern door, soaking it in like sunlight. Then the lute player fainted. Stephen was halfway through greeting a vendor when a shriek cut through the music. He spun around to see the musician sprawled on the stage, his lute clattering to the floor. A crowd gathered instantly, murmuring like bees in a hive. "Heatstroke," someone whispered. Stephen's stomach dropped. The festival was in full swing, hundreds of people milling about, expecting entertainment. If the music stopped, the energy would nosedive faster than a juicer off a horse. He was about to sprint toward the stage when a voice cut through the chaos. "Stephen!" Clara was weaving through the crowd, her chestnut hair catching the sunlight like a beacon. She reached him, slightly breathless but calm in a way that made Stephen's pulse steady. "I heard what happened. What's the plan?" Stephen blinked. "Plan?" Clara arched an eyebrow. "You do have one, right? Because right now, your bard looks like he's auditioning for a medieval crime scene." Stephen groaned. "I was hoping for divine intervention." "Well," Clara said, scanning the crowd, "unless you've got a saint on speed dial, we need a backup act." Stephen stared at her. "You have any ideas?" Clara's lips curved into a grin that was equal parts mischief and challenge. "As a matter of fact, I do." Before Stephen could ask, she grabbed his hand, his actual hand, and pulled him toward the stage. His brain short-circuited at the contact, but his feet followed, because apparently Clara had gravitational pull. "What are we?" Stephen started, but Clara was already climbing onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called, her voice ringing clear over the murmurs. "Our brave bard needs a moment to recover, but the show must go on. So, who's ready for a little improv?" The crowd cheered, because crowds will cheer for anything if you sound confident enough. Stephen stood frozen as Clara turned to him, eyes sparkling. "You know any stories?" she asked. Stephen blinked. "Stories? Medieval ones," she said, grabbing the lute and strumming a surprisingly decent chord. "You built a whole town. Don't tell me you don't have a few tales up your sleeve." Stephen's mind raced. He had stories, dozens of them, from years of role-playing games and fantasy novels. But telling them? On stage? In front of 100 people? Clara leaned in, her voice low and teasing. "Come on, visionary. Show me what you've got." Something in her tone, playful, daring, lit a spark in Stephen's chest. He stepped forward, took a deep breath, and launched into a tale about a knight who mistook a dragon for a very large chicken. It was ridiculous, but Clara laughed, and the crowd laughed, and suddenly Stephen was flying. Clara strummed along, adding dramatic flourishes at all the wrong moments, and Stephen played off her timing like they'd rehearsed for weeks. When he described the knight's heroic charge, Clara punctuated it with a triumphant chord that made the kids in the front row cheer. When he revealed the dragon's poultry identity, she hit a mournful note so exaggerated that even the goat, Sir Hoofington, bleated in protest. By the time the real musician returned, the crowd was roaring with laughter, and Stephen was grinning so hard his cheeks hurt. Clara handed the lute back with a flourish and hopped off the stage, her eyes dancing. "Not bad," she said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "For a guy who thought divine intervention was a strategy." Stephen laughed, breathless. "You saved the festival." Clara shrugged, that mischievous smile tugging at her lips. "You built the town. I just kept it from collapsing." Stephen looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift. It wasn't just attraction. It was admiration, respect, and a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Something that scared him a little. Something that thrilled him even more. Chapter 9. Doubts and distractions. The festival had been a triumph. Photos flooded social media, vendors reported record sales, and the Jolly Jester was booked solid for weeks. Stephen should have been riding high, basking in the glow of success. Instead, he was staring at his phone, watching his inbox explode. Quarterly review moved up. Need projections by Monday. Client wants revisions on the design specs, urgent. Conference call tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. Stephen groaned, rubbing his temples. His city job, the one he'd built his entire adult life around, was demanding blood. He'd taken a few days off for the festival, but now the corporate machine was roaring back, and it didn't care about medieval dreams. He glanced out the tavern window. Clara was in the square, laughing with Megan as they arranged flowers around the fountain. The sound drifted through the open door, warm and bright, and for a moment, Stephen felt torn in two. He wanted to be out there, hammering signs, planning the next event, maybe stealing a few minutes to talk to Clara without a clipboard in his hand. But the weight of responsibility pressed hard. He had deadlines, obligations, a career that didn't pause for justs and jesters. By the time he finished his calls, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and rose. Stephen stepped outside, hoping to catch Clara before she left, but the square was empty except for a few lingering vendors packing up their wares. He spotted her near the seamstress booth, folding gowns into neat stacks. For a moment he just watched, the way her hair caught the fading light, the easy grace of her movements. Then he walked over, forcing a smile. "Hey," he said. "Sorry I disappeared. Work stuff." Clara looked up, her smile polite but cooler than before. "No problem. You've got a lot on your plate." Stephen hesitated. "I wanted to help with the cleanup." "It's fine," she said, her tone light but distant. "We managed." Something in her voice, soft, almost casual, hit harder than any boardroom critique. Stephen opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure what to say. He'd faced CEOs without blinking, but one look from Clara and he felt like a rookie in his own life. "I'll be around tomorrow," he said finally. Clara nodded, but her eyes didn't quite meet his. "Sure." Stephen walked back to the tavern, the weight in his chest heavier than any ledger. He told himself it was exhaustion, stress, the juggling act of two worlds. But deep down, he knew better. Clara thought he didn't care. And the worst part? He wasn't sure how to prove that he did, without losing everything he'd worked for. Chapter 10. The Grand Jester. Stephen had never been the Grand Jester type. He was practical, measured, the guy who planned everything down to the last decimal. But as he stood in the tavern, staring at the carved throne by the hearth, he knew spreadsheets weren't going to fix this. Clara had been polite these past few days, helpful, smiling when necessary, but the spark, the teasing, the laughter, the way her eyes used to linger was gone. And Stephen hated it. He hated the distance, hated the hollow feeling that settled in his chest every time she walked away. He wanted to tell her the truth, that she mattered, that this dream wasn't complete without her, that somewhere between timber beams and jester statues, she'd become the most unexpected, most important part of it all. But words weren't enough. So Stephen planned something bigger, something bold, something that would make Clara see exactly where he stood. The second festival was the perfect stage. The square was alive with color, banners snapping in the breeze, vendors calling out their wares, music spilling from the tavern door. Stephen moved through the crowd, heart pounding, dressed in a costume he'd sworn he'd never wear, a knight's tunic, complete with a ridiculous feathered cap. Paul spotted him and nearly choked on his ale. "Oh, this is rich," he said, grinning. "Sir Stephen of Spreadsheet." "Laugh it up," Stephen muttered, adjusting the cap. "I've got a quest." And he did, because at the center of the square, Clara was arranging flowers around the fountain, her hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. Stephen took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and strode toward her like a man about to joust with destiny. "Lady Clara," he said, voice carrying just enough to draw attention. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Stephen ignored the heat crawling up his neck. Clara looked up, startled, and then her eyes widened as she took in his outfit. "Oh, wow." Stephen dropped to one knee, ignoring the snickers rippling through the crowd. "I come bearing a proclamation," he said, pulling a scroll from his belt. Okay, it was a menu he'd repurposed, but no one needed to know that. Clara blinked. "Stephen, what are you?" "Hear ye, hear ye," Stephen declared, unrolling the scroll with a flourish. "Let it be known that Sir Stephen of Jackson's Hollow seeks the favor of Lady Clara, fairest among maidens, bravest among festival saviors." The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter. Someone shouted, "Read on, Sir Stephen." Stephen grinned, heart hammering, and continued. "Forsooth," he said, "because if you're going to humiliate yourself, you might as well commit. This knight hath pondered long and hard, and hath concluded that no quest, no kingdom, no tavern is complete without the lady who stole his heart while strumming a lute and mocking his homicidal jester." Clara's cheeks flushed pink, her lips curving into a smile that made Stephen's knees wobble harder than kneeling already did. "Stephen." He tossed the scroll aside and stood, closing the distance between them. "I got caught up in work," he said softly, so only she could hear. "But this is what matters. You matter." For a heartbeat, silence. Then Clara laughed, a warm, bright sound that wrapped around him like sunlight. "You're ridiculous," she said, eyes shining. "Completely," Stephen agreed. "But I'm yours if you want me." Clara tilted her head, studying him like she was weighing the merits of a knight in a feathered cap. Then she stepped closer, her smile softening. "I think I do." The crowd cheered as Stephen pulled her into his arms, laughter and music swirling around them like magic. For the first time in weeks, the hollow ache in his chest vanished, replaced by something fierce and certain. Stephen had built a town, a tavern, a dream. But Clara? Clara was the part he hadn't planned for, the part that made it all worth it. Chapter 11. Happily Ever After with Ale. 6 months later, Jackson's Hollow was no longer a dream. It was a destination. The medieval town bustled with life. Vendors lined the cobblestone paths. Okay, faux cobblestone, but no one cared, selling everything from hand-forged trinkets to honey mead. Children darted through the square with wooden swords, their laughter mingling with the strains of lute music drifting from the Jolly Jester. The tavern itself had become the beating heart of the hollow, warm, lively, and always full. Stephen stood behind the polished mahogany bar, wiping down a tankard as the fire crackled in the hearth. The carved throne sat in its rightful place, and in it, Earl Jackson reigned supreme. Crown slightly crooked, robe draped over his shoulders, he held court like a man born for the role. Visitors gathered around him, hanging on his stories of the old days, which now included a suspicious number of dragons and heroic quests. Beside the throne sat another chair smaller, but no less regal, reserved for the town's magister, Mayor Evelyn, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who had taken to her honorary role with gusto. Stephen had caught Earl blushing more than once when she laughed at his jokes. The family pretended not to notice, but the twinkle in Earl's eyes said everything. Stephen smiled, letting the warmth of the scene settle deep in his chest. This was what he'd wanted. A place where people came together, where joy lingered like the scent of fresh bread. Promise kept, a dream fulfilled. And then Clara walked in. She wore a simple green dress that looked like it had stepped straight out of a fairy tale, her chestnut hair tumbling over her shoulders. Stephen's heart did that ridiculous flip it always did when he saw her, even after months of being together. She crossed the room with easy grace, sliding behind the bar like she belonged there, because she did. "Full house tonight," she said, brushing a stray lock from her face. "We might need more ale." Stephen grinned. "Already on it." Clara leaned against the bar, her eyes dancing. "You know, when you first told me about this place, I thought you were insane." Stephen chuckled. "You weren't wrong. And now?" he asked, tilting his head. Clara's smile softened. "Now I think you're brilliant." Stephen reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Couldn't have done it without you." She squeezed his hand, her gaze steady and warm. "Good thing I like a challenge." Stephen laughed, pulling her close as the tavern filled with music and chatter. Outside, lanterns glowed along the square, casting golden halos on the cobblestones. Inside, the hearth roared, the ale flowed, and Earl raised his tankard in a toast that echoed through the hall. To family, he bellowed. To dreams. And to the Jolly Jester. The crowd cheered, tankards clinking, laughter spilling like sunlight. Stephen kissed Clara's temple, his heart full to bursting. He'd spent years chasing success, thinking it lived in glass towers and boardrooms. But it was here, in a tavern built on love and laughter, with a woman who made him believe in magic again, that Stephen finally understood. Happily ever after wasn't a fairy tale. It was a promise kept, a dream shared, and a life lived with joy, and maybe, just maybe, a pint of ale.